In June 2022, members of the World Trade Organization will meet in Geneva to establish a new treaty to discipline harmful fisheries subsidies. Together, they have the opportunity to strike a deal to protect the ocean and to support food, jobs, and incomes in fishing communities around the world. They're negotiating this treaty because overfishing is a pressing sustainable development challenge. Approximately 34% of marine fish stocks are already exploited beyond sustainable levels, and subsidies that increase fishing capacity and incentivize overfishing are a big part of the problem. Overfishing harms the marine environment, but also undermines the livelihoods of communities who depend on fish for food security and for jobs. The good news is that WTO members now have a draft agreement on the table, and they're very close to a deal. So what agreement exactly are we talking about? In terms of scope, the potential new rules on fisheries subsidies would only apply to marine wild capture fishing and fishing-related activities at sea. This means that subsidies to aquaculture, inland fisheries, and any land-based activities would not be affected. The draft agreement includes rules that cover three main substantive areas: a prohibition of subsidies for vessels or operators engaged in illegal, unreported, and unregulated, or IUU fishing, a prohibition of subsidies for the fishing of overfished stocks, and disciplines on subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing more generally. First, WTO members are working to ban subsidies to fishing vessels or operators who are engaged in IUU fishing or who support such fishing. So basically, under Article 3 of the draft text, members would agree not to subsidize a fishing vessel, the operator of that fishing vessel, or any supporting fishing-related activity at sea when a determination is made that the fishing vessel or operator has engaged in IUU fishing. That determination could be made by a coastal member if the IUU activity has taken place in its own waters, by a flag state member if the vessel is flying its flag, or by a regional fisheries management organization or arrangement for activities under its competence. There's a carefully negotiated balance in the text between the rights of those making determinations and the rights of those responding to them. The text proposes that determinations made by coastal states and regional fisheries management organizations must be based on relevant factual information and follow a few key procedural steps to ensure that unfair determinations don't trigger a subsidy prohibition. So a fair determination will trigger the subsidy prohibition. But the draft text allows the subsidizing member to consider the seriousness or the repetition of an infraction when it decides how long subsidies are prohibited for, although there would be a minimum limit in place. WTO members have also debated what kind of special treatment under this rule would be appropriate for developing country members, if any. This is a recurring question throughout the negotiations. The draft text suggests that subsidies to IUU fishing by artisanal fishers that operate within 12 nautical miles of the coast would benefit from a 2-year grace period. This means the prohibition would still apply to subsidies to those activities, but WTO members would not be able to enforce the rule for that period of time. The second substantive rule is a prohibition of subsidies to the fishing of overfished stocks. That's covered in Article 4 of the draft text. And there's a careful balance struck here too. When a coastal member state or a regional fisheries management organization recognizes that a stock is in an overfished condition, considering the best scientific evidence available to it, then members would be prohibited from subsidizing the fishing of that stock. But what about situations in which policy efforts are made to help restore the stock? There, the text suggests an exception. If the subsidies themselves or fisheries management measures are in place that aim to rebuild fish stocks, subsidization would be allowed to continue. And much like the IUU rule, the text suggests a 2-year grace period for subsidies in developing country members to artisanal fishing of overfished stocks that occurs within that 12 nautical mile limit of the coast. The third substantive area, and the one that likely will have the biggest potential impact, is a set of rules on subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing more broadly. It includes a number of proposed disciplines covered in Article 5 of the draft text. The first and main rule would prohibit subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, including a list of certain subsidy types that are widely considered to be the most likely to incentivize overcapacity and overfishing. This list includes, among others, subsidies to help fishers cover capital costs, like new vessels, engines, or fishing gear, and variable costs, such as fuel, as well as subsidies that specifically target fishing anywhere beyond a member's waters. Now, there are two key elements in the text that balance this broad prohibition. The first element is a qualifier built into the prohibition itself. A WTO member can continue to provide any of the subsidies listed if it can show there are measures in place to maintain fish stocks at sustainable levels. The second element is special and differential treatment for developing country members. Here, the text suggests a combination of temporary and permanent exemptions from the main prohibition. First, it suggests a time-limited exemption for subsidies to developing country members' fleets that fish within their domestic exclusive economic zone or that fish under the competence of a regional fisheries management organization. So developing country members could continue to provide subsidies listed to their larger scale fleets in those areas without having to show they have management measures in place for a period of time. Second, the text proposes permanent exemptions from the main prohibition for subsidies from particular members or for particular types of fishing. Subsidies could be provided without the need to show management measures are in place in least developed country members, in those developing countries that account for less than 0.7% of global catch of marine fish, and in developing members' artisanal fleets when they fish within those 12 nautical miles of their shore. Importantly, members using these exemptions should still try to ensure those subsidies don't contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. While most members could live with the overall balance struck here between prohibitions and exceptions, there are important differences of view regarding the timeframes or geographic scope of these exceptions and which members should be able to use them. Many of these final decisions will likely need to be taken by ministers. There are other standalone elements of Article 5 that will weigh in the balance for ministers. A second prohibition in Article 5 focuses on fishing activities in areas beyond a member's own waters. It would ban all subsidies from all members to fishing in the high seas that is not regulated by a regional fisheries management organization. A third prohibition in Article 5 targets subsidies for fishing vessels that are not under the direct control of the subsidizing member. Right now, the text suggests two possible alternatives for this rule. The first alternative would prohibit subsidies to vessels that don't fly the flag of the member subsidizing the vessel. The second, more general alternative would ban subsidies to vessels over which the subsidizing member has no control or jurisdiction, unless it can ensure in another way that such subsidies don't contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. Of course, the draft agreement also addresses a number of legal and institutional issues on topics like notifications and transparency, dispute settlement, and monitoring of compliance. But the important thing to be aware of here is that in this treaty, the notification obligations play a crucial role in the overall balance between prohibitions and exceptions. The text includes the idea of requiring notification of information, pointing to the use of forced labor on fishing vessels, an important issue for some members. But more generally, under the agreement, WTO members would have to provide information about the fisheries they subsidize, and meeting this requirement would be needed to use the exceptions in the agreement, like the fisheries management measures qualifier in the main prohibition, or the special and differential treatment exceptions. Most of the text on the table is what negotiators would call stabilized. There's widespread support for the careful balances crafted. The issues that remain are few, and some really require political decisions. Ministers have an opportunity to resolve, together, these last few issues, and to forge a historic agreement to help restore the world's ocean and protect those who depend on it. That is to say, all of us. It is within reach.